Africa is a huge continent. Geographically, you could fit all of Europe, all of the United States, all of Russia, all of China, and India into the one continent. The way we see it on the maps doesn't really give the size of the continent full justice. And within this huge geographical area, in which a single game park in Zambia would be half the size of Switzerland, for instance, you have 55 different countries. So to talk about Africa is about as meaningless as talking about the Americans when you're talking about Canada right down to the lowest tip of Chile and Peru. You're talking about 55 very different countries, and they've all had very different formations, not only in terms of their own national historical cultures, but in terms of the different colonial experiences that they had to go through. That colonial experience is some 300 years old, but was only really formalized in terms of a formal European ownership of Africa in 1884. Christmas 84, New Year 85, the representatives of the great powers of Europe met in Berlin. It was called the Berlin Conference, and they divided up Africa. For them, it wasn't a continent even worth going to war over, but over Christmas and New Year dinner and drinks, they basically took lines on a map. Some of the lines are extremely straight lines, and simply divided up all of this continent according to European presences already there, and according to negotiations that took place far away from Africa in Berlin. This meant that the Africa that slowly began gaining independence, 1957, Ghana gained independence, and in the 1960s, the majority of the other African countries began gaining independence. It meant they had to achieve a nationhood in the first instance, which was artificial. If you were to divide up Africa according to all of the historical nations that once existed, you're looking at 2,000 different nations. Obviously, in today's world, that is impossible. But 55 artificial nations poses a very different challenge entirely. And then making those 55 artificial nations coherent with new forms of statehood, new state formations, driving a development agenda and a public administration agenda through these new states, it's no wonder there were so many difficulties in the early years of African independence. And now when we look back some 50 or so years later, it's actually amazing in retrospect how well they have done, starting from a sub-zero base, as it were, and what has been accomplished, albeit with ongoing difficulties today. So now is really the moment when Africa has begun to turn away from looking at itself, having diplomatic relations of a serious nature only with other African nations, and begun looking very seriously indeed at a diplomatic outreach to the wider world, so that its participation in the Chinese sphere of operations, its interest in terms of good relationships with the United States, all of these things are quite recent, serious endeavors on the part of African diplomacy. But in the first instance, it played a major role in the development of the non-aligned movement. It saw the emerging states from other parts of the world as analogous to African states, having the same kinds of difficulties. And this kind of solidarity in the early days of the non-aligned movement was very, very helpful to Africa in terms of building up its morale, in terms of thinking we are not alone. So that a state like Zambia, for instance, gained independence with only 99 university graduates, only 2 of whom had received scholarships from the British government. In other words, having to field a public administration that was not qualified because no one had bothered to help with the qualifications of figures within the Zambian government and public administration. There was immediate assistance coming from other non-aligned states such as India. So a very great number of the early cabinet ministers of Zambia received their degrees at Indian universities, for instance. Through such means of solidarity, public administration and development began slowly taking off. But even though Africa has now reached the point of having much more mature, much more developed diplomatic relations with the outside world, the Western metropolitan world, the Chinese world, etc., what new aspects of diplomatic and political practice is Africa able to give to the rest of the world? And here we have two interesting aspects of African development, African organization in terms of a continental body, the African Union, and African approaches to solving conflicts within Africa itself. Let me talk in the first instance about the African Union. It's a direct effort to replicate, as far as they can, the European Union. In other words, a continental body which would bring together all of the governments of the continent underneath an apparatus which would harmonize standards, harmonize approaches to things like human rights, harmonize approaches and bring cooperation into areas such as peacekeeping. It's not been spectacularly successful, but all of the apparatus which could eventually make it successful are now in place. In a country where it's extremely difficult, for instance, to get from one end of the continent to the other, and where sometimes you've got to fly to Europe first before you can get to another part of Africa, the need for infrastructural development is probably going to depend to a very large extent on cooperation, diplomatic and economic cooperation with the Chinese, who have the skills and the willingness to build transcontinental transport communications links, roads, railways. Those kinds of things will be the beginnings physically of a genuine cooperation and a genuine Pan-Africanism of the future. But the diplomatic tools have already been constructed for that future moment. What Africa brings to the table in terms of how to settle international disputes, however, is controversial but also of very great interest. And you look back to 2007, 2008, 2007, the hotly disputed elections in Kenya. 2008, the equally heated disputation of the so-called results of the election in Zimbabwe. Into both hugely difficult arenas came two African statesmen. In Kenya, the former United Nations Secretary General, a man of Ghanaian birth, Kofi Annan, he came in as the mediator. To Zimbabwe and the fractious politics of that country came the South African President, Thabo Mbeki. And even though these were two separate elections in two very, very different states, mediated by two very different statesmen, both of whom were vastly experienced, they came to the same conclusion, that what was at stake here was twofold. It wasn't democracy in the first instance. Democracy in Africa would not be helpful if people were dead and dying. It was not having a government in which the winner in an election took everything. It had to be a government of inclusiveness. So the values of inclusiveness and the values of ongoing safety of the civilian and citizen body were given a preeminence, given a priority over the results of a democratic exercise in the first instance. Where those democratic exercises were put to use was in terms not of who was going to be president, but in terms of the construction of the government underneath the president, so that the number of seats won in the election determined how many seats in the cabinet you had, not just how many seats in the parliament you had, but how many ministers you could have around the cabinet table. This was a way forward devised separately by both Kofi Annan in Kenya and Thabo Mbeki in Zimbabwe, which preserved the peace in both countries. It led to an enforced cooperation between the political parties in both countries, and it led to a moment in which it could not be said that the winner took everything. In other words, the idea of participation and sharing in the benefits of politics and of government they were seen to be more pluralistic in the long run than what you might see in many Western democracies. Obviously, this is the beginning of a very difficult and very controversial way forward, which may or may not be successfully applied in other African problem areas. But the values here that were put forward, the norms of inclusiveness and the norms to do with citizen safety, these may yet prove to be a gift to the outside world, which might come via the medium of African diplomacy.